everyone, and thank you for joining us here at Material Positions. My name is Jimbo Yo, and I am your host. This is the very first episode of Material Positions, so let me tell you everything you need to know. Material Positions started as just a concept on Discord. A bunch of us friends wanted a way to effectively communicate and discuss political ideas in the public that would normally be marginalized for being too far left or too radical. Our aim here is to get the perspective of people from all the quote-unquote scary leftist thought tendencies to help our listeners and anyone who might come across our podcast just see the human side of these ideas and be sympathetic to why these ideas exist in the first place, and hopefully even take on some of these ideas themselves or learn some things. We want to use our perspectives to analyze current events, culture, media, art, and online communications, and just try to bring about awareness of alternate ways of looking at the world besides what's presented in the mainstream and in a lot of more popular online spaces. A little bit about myself. Again, my name is Jimbo. I'm a Marxist. I'm originally from California, but I've been moving all over the US for the past few years. I'm in my mid-20s and my occupational specialization is journalism, digital media, and media analysis. Since this is our very first episode and I just want to get it out there, I'll be the only host this time, but typically this show will be centered around discourse between multiple people, and I want to have other people on to host the show sometimes too. Today, for this episode, we're going to be doing a film analysis. I really want to do more episodes like this, so expect some more, but also feel free to let me know what kind of content you want to see. The film that we're looking at today is Spike Lee's Da 5 Bloods, which was released June 12th of this year, straight to streaming. It features some decently big names like Chadwick Boseman from Black Panther and Delroy Lindo from Malcolm X and Crooklyn. Clark Peters from The Wire is also in there, along with Jonathan Majors from The Last Black Man in San Francisco, which I have yet to watch, but I really want to see. As a quick disclaimer, this is going to include spoilers. I'm going to discuss the ending quite a bit, so I'd suggest that if you care, you should probably go watch the movie before going any further in this episode. Da 5 Bloods is a pretty intricate film in terms of its content and central themes. All at once, it's a Vietnam flick, a story about black identity and brotherhood, a character-driven personal journey, and a timepiece conjoining the 1960s and now. The plot starts off pretty simple. It's about 4 black Vietnam vets who return to Vietnam to recover the remains of their 5th squad member, Storm and Norman, from their squad called Da 5 Bloods. The 4 surviving Bloods consist of Eddie, a car dealership owner who's seen as rich by the others; Otis, played by Clark Peters, a sort of calm, compassionate friend; Melvin, a jolly but cynical guy who honestly really doesn't play a very big part or experience a ton of character development; and then Paul, who's played by Delroy Lindo. And Paul's a bitter, depressed Trump supporter who ends up becoming probably the most developed character by the end of the movie and probably gets the most screen time as well. What we find out pretty early on is that the Bloods aren't just in Vietnam to recover their friend's remains. When they were in the military during the Vietnam War, in the same spot where Norman died, the Bloods buried a bunch of gold bars. Their mission was to recover the bars from a crashed CIA plane that was delivering them to a local tribe as payment for their aid against the Viet Cong. The Bloods made it to the plane, but all the plane's crew were killed, so Norman convinced the Bloods that they should bury the gold, come back for it later, and put it toward black liberation. Norman was killed during a Viet Cong ambush that happened shortly after, but the other 4 Bloods escaped and lied to the military that the gold was already gone when they arrived. The Bloods are now coming back for the gold and Norman's body decades later, but they intend to keep the gold for themselves instead, and they've arranged a deal with this shady French gold broker through Otis's ex-girlfriend, who we find out is also his baby mama. Paul's son, David, a struggling teacher played by Jonathan Majors, is also unexpectedly introduced into the story. He shows up out of nowhere to join the Bloods after we find out that he hacked his dad Paul's email and figured out about the gold, and he wants a cut now. This is pretty much all the base plot, about 45 minutes into the story. I don't want to just spend this whole episode describing the entire story, so I'm going to leave it at that and focus on the themes from here on out. But I'll of course keep referencing parts of the story throughout as necessary. The first thing that I really liked about Da 5 Bloods was that the cast was very representative of their characters. I went through IMDb, I double-checked all this. All the Vietnamese characters were actually played by Vietnamese and Southeast Asian people versus just a bunch of passing actors from other Asian ethnicities. The stars were all black, which is always awesome to see in a mainstream big-budget film. They even got French people to play the French characters and a Finnish actor to play the one Finnish character, which all this might sound like the bare minimum in terms of representation, and it is, but you'd be surprised how many actors play characters who are an entirely different ethnicity or nationality. And this also might not sound that important on the surface, but it really is important because you don't want actors playing a caricature. So when an actor is actually from the culture that they're playing. They can nuance their acting accurately instead of based on some racist straw man that they've come up with or that they've created based on their interpreter or accent coach that the studio assigns them. A lot of the only exposure that a lot of people get to other cultures is through film, so this is really important. You don't want people getting the wrong idea because of an actor who's playing an entirely different race than they are. And this has created a lot of damaging ideas all over the world. The second thing that I really liked about The Five Bloods was the inclusion of Black history and the relatively unapologetic historical rendition of the Vietnam War. Spike Lee is kind of known for inserting slides with pictures and information about Black historical figures whenever a character discusses them in his films, and he did that a lot into Five Bloods. He also started and ended the film with some pretty famous speeches. The film starts with Muhammad Ali's speech about not wanting to go to the draft because of racism. And then the film ended with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech at the Riverside Church in NYC on April 4th of 1967, which was about exactly a year before he was assassinated. There was also a scene when one of the Vietnamese antagonists, who comes in later in the film, explains to the Bloods about Lieutenant Calley and the My Lai massacre, along with some really gruesome pictures. There were tons of other times throughout the movie where the US military was criticized. Paul at one point mentions Agent Orange and its effects on people, including himself. There's photos of children who've been napalmed. During the My Lai part, they show a really gruesome picture of a baby who's been shot in the face. It doesn't lionize the US like a lot of other Vietnam films do. A really important inclusion to the film, and this theme overall, was Hanoi Hannah, based off a real Vietnamese broadcaster. At one point, she does this pseudo-poetic speech targeting Black GIs, where she touches on topics of racism in America and tells a pretty staggering statistic that I learned through this film, which is that Black men made up 33% of all US troops deployed to Vietnam, despite only making up 11% of the population at the time. So I like all of this quite a bit. It's not the first film to take a critical stance toward the Vietnam War, but to my knowledge that I can't really think of any other films, at least mainstream ones, that tackle Vietnam from a Black perspective. So that's a really unique and important aspect of The Five Bloods, because so many Black men made up the soldiers who went to Vietnam to fight, but yet we always see white men starring in these Vietnam films. We get the Rambos, etc. So the last thing that I really liked about The Five Bloods was the cinematography and the acting. I'm not a fanatic for Spike Lee, but I really enjoy his style, especially his long takes and his camera movement. Not a lot of directors can make a long take look that good, and that's why you really don't see many directors doing it as often as Spike Lee. There was a pretty good amount of experimentalism into Five Bloods as well, and a couple scenes in particular. First is the scene when the Bloods find the site where they think the gold is buried. It's this super long take of the guys running around on the hill with a metal detector looking for the gold bars, and based on their movements and how long the take is, it looks like Spike or someone from the crew probably actually went around and buried the gold bars and then told the actors go out and find them while on camera. So that was a pretty cool scene. Later in the film, the character of Paul ends up leaving the group to try to keep all of his gold to himself without splitting it, and he enters these deranged monologues where he's talking to himself and the camera's facing him directly pretty up close on his face and following him backwards as he walks forward, and they're just really, really well acted, and they almost seem ad-lib, like Delroy is just freestyling and just coming up with this stuff on the spot. He really knocked it out of the park. I would say Delroy Lindo's performance as Paul in The Five Bloods is probably one of the best performances I've seen in anything that's been released, at least on streaming this year. So overall, a lot of things to like about it. It was a very progressive movie in a lot of ways. There was definitely a lot of very important historical information in it that was very vital to its overall theme and message. But what I want to get into next is a few fairly problematic things that I noticed throughout the movie, and themes that are not necessarily the best reflection of reality or send the best messages overall. I watched The Five Bloods a couple times, and using a couple different methods of analysis, I noticed a few things that are definitely not the best. So let's get into those. So The Five Bloods does not really pull off female representation very well. There are only 4 female characters in the entire film, none of whom receive any screen time without a man in the same scene, except for a little less than 1 minute sequence where Chen, who, like I said before, is Otis's baby mama, and Michonne, who's their daughter, talk about Otis after he exits. So it just totally fails pretty much every Bechdel test I can think of. I actually have not checked their behind the camera crew, so don't take my word for that. The only female that is not either a love interest or a family member of one of the main male characters is Hanoi Hannah, who's a radio show host and doesn't interact with anyone else in the film. The female characters are all pretty much portrayed as subordinate and weak compared to the male characters who do all the hero shit, pretty much. Chen also is a former prostitute, which is just a very tired, old cliche for Vietnamese women in films. It was very unnecessary and a strange inclusion overall. Hedy is one of the other female characters. She's a French woman who runs a nonprofit disarming landmines in Vietnam, and ultimately becomes David, who, like I said before, is Paul's son, David's love interest. Hedy definitely has some slightly more heroic moments, but always just as an aid to the Bloods, never on her own or by way of her own independence. Like, for instance, one of those heroic moments Hedy has is when David is injured and she holds him upright so he can shoot a guy. It's just, in general, it's a bro flick, complete with, you know, all the action and hot girls and yada yada. And I know with Vietnam War movies, it's going to be fairly male-centric since only men were drafted in the U.S. to go fight. But there were still obviously fuck tons of women in Vietnam, the Vietnamese women. And I have yet to see a female Vietnamese perspective take the lead in a Vietnam War film. So the last thing I touched on segues into another big problem with The Five Bloods, which is its treatment of the Vietnamese characters, which I was really disappointed in by the end of the film, because early on it seemed like it was taking a much more sympathetic perspective and going beneath the surface of typical American beliefs about the Vietnam War. The earliest and best example I can think of is the first flashback scene in the film, which is this action scene showing when the Bloods first arrived at the plane crash where they found the gold. This entire scene was just this typical Rambo-esque Viet Cong murder porn, just 4 minutes straight of each American soldier killing 15 plus Viet Cong in a firefight, you know, blood everywhere, real realistic for the US who got their fucking ass kicked. And then after this scene, it cuts back to the present, and the Bloods are walking through Ho Chi Minh City with their tour guide. You know, a nice McDonald's is in the background. Otis says something along the lines of, I hate these Rambo movies, and I hate all these Hollywood motherfuckers trying to go back and win Vietnam. And so this, to me, seemed totally self-aware because of its proximity to the ridiculous firefight scene before it. That actually gave me a lot of hope for the movie when I first saw it, along with a couple other sequences fairly early in the film that address the awful effects that the war had on the Vietnamese people. There's a scene very early on where a young boy who's missing a leg comes into a restaurant and begs the Bloods for money. And then later, when the Bloods exit the restaurant, he throws firecrackers to scare them. Later on, this chicken vendor in a boat market erupts on Paul after Paul calls him racial slurs, saying, "You killed my mother and my father." But even though there are these few moments that make the film seem kind of somewhat self-aware, the Vietnamese people are still ultimately used as props and make up the vast majority of the body count from the film's gratuitous violent scenes. In addition to that, the only Vietnamese characters that have a significant amount of interaction with the Bloods are Chen, who again is Otis's baby mama, and Vin, the tour guide I mentioned before, who are both pretty much secondary characters and totally subordinate to the main characters. Vin, the tour guide, is one I'd like to talk about in particular. His character is totally a token, right? He's this good, friendly, southern Vietnamese man, right? He's a tour guide and a tour business owner who brings Westerners on tours of Vietnam. He's very apologetic about the Vietnam War, more so than pretty much any other Vietnamese character, and he's portrayed in like a more highly moral light in that way. He speaks very softly, and he's always taking orders from the Bloods. He never disagrees with them and just comes in with little quips of wisdom every now and then. It's very, very stereotypical and trope-like. It goes back to the 1920s and D.W. Griffith with this shit, like just portraying, you know, the good Asian person who contrasts from the savage enemies and is this wise companion. It's very dated for this film. It really feels dated. This is just a really damaging portrayal to put in any film. It just invalidates the rage of victims of Western imperialism and portrays them as hostiles for opposing U.S. aggression toward their country. And it sends the message that the right way for these people to cope with imperialism is to be subordinate and accepting of their country's imminent westernization. Even worse overall is the fact that the Bloods are positioned in opposition to the Vietnamese people, and the Vietnamese are portrayed as a violent alien obstacle to the Bloods' quest for gold. This was really disappointing because, again, the film seemed really self-aware early on. In a flashback scene, the Bloods ambush and kill this group of Viet Cong soldiers, but before they kill the guys, the subtitles show that the Viet Cong were lamenting about how much they love their families, and one guy talks about a poem that his wife wrote him. In a preceding flashback, the Bloods listen to Hanoi Hannah and realize that they're being used as pawns by white bourgeois imperialism. So this awareness is completely abandoned by the end of the film, because it just quickly turns into this total shoot-'em-up fest of Vietnamese bodies. It becomes like a typical Rambo fantasy, except with black soldiers instead of white ones. It's just a very problematic portrayal because colonized people should not be fighting with each other over the scraps of the white imperialist bourgeois. That's the message that this film sends, that the relatively meager amount of gold that the Bloods are looking for, 17 million, is worth the death of their friends and dozens of anonymized Vietnamese people. The Five Bloods disappointed me so much in that way because it really seemed like it was leading up to a certain amount of material awareness and unity, but just ends with this individualist overall message. The very ending of the film, its conclusion, is alright in some ways, but it's by no means justice to everything that went on throughout the rest of the film. Long story short, all the Bloods are dead except for Otis and David. Paul lost his share of gold in the jungle before he died, so basically 13 million worth of gold is left by the end of the film. David and Otis still keep some to themselves, but they give away 8 million. 2 million of that 8 million goes to Eddie's family, one of the Bloods who died. Another 2 million went to Black Lives Matter. 3 million went to Hetty's nonprofit, and 1 million went to Vin, who at the end is shown writing a check to donate it to an unknown source that they never elaborate on. Despite this seeming like a generous and wholesome conclusion, there's still some serious problems with it. First off, a disproportionate amount of money goes to Hetty's nonprofit, a bourgeois, toxic charity completely staffed and run by white foreigners. For those who may not have heard of toxic charity, it's when a charity tries to help a marginalized locality, but due to their chauvinism doesn't employ or educate the locality, which belittles their skills and intelligence. Charity is patronizing if it doesn't give the locality the tools to help themselves. Removing landmines is a noble cause, but giving 3 times as much money to the white nonprofit as you did to the one Vietnamese person is just fucking ridiculous. Like, why? There's no reason even given. Even more so, why does Hetty get more money than Black Lives Matter, and Black Lives Matter only gets as much as Eddie's 2 kids? Like, this is why the ending seems so damn individualist to me. The individual characters are treated as more important than the collective at the end, despite there being so many collectivist messages throughout the film, particularly from flashbacks with Storm and Norman, who they lionize all throughout the film. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me and seems kind of inconsistent. Individualism and opportunism led to the Bloods' deaths, but in the end, the individualism is portrayed as justice. So overall, my feelings toward the Five Bloods are pretty mixed. It's honestly a really conflicted film in terms of its message. It preaches collectivism through the words of the characters, but the way the story unfolds totally pushes individualism. It's way better in terms of content than the typical American Vietnam War murder porn movie, but it fails to do the Vietnamese people any justice in terms of their portrayal. I mean, more so than the typical Vietnam movie, and I will definitely give it that, but still in the end, it's a very pro-American movie. I think that ultimately The Five Bloods is more of a character-based story about regret and redemption, because one of the biggest aspects of the story is Paul's emotional progression, because by the end of the movie, we learn that Paul accidentally killed Norman, and that's why he's been carrying so much hate and pain with him. And then he's visited by Norman's ghost right before his death, who forgives him. So I just feel like The Five Bloods tried to cover a lot of different bases in terms of themes, and it did very well with a lot of them. But the problem to me came with the conflict of fitting enough character-centric content while also fitting enough content that's historically reflective, and it doesn't really fully flesh out the historical reflection. Like I've said, this film is really successful in a lot of ways. Great representation among the cast, some great historical facts included, and an awesome style overall, amazing acting. But in the end, it kind of turned out to be a dude boomer shoot 'em up flick. Just, the latter half of the film was really disappointing because it honestly backpedaled on most of its progressive messages and turned into just blood and gore. It's not a bad film, don't get me wrong. I would recommend it to a lot of people. And it's a mainstream film, so it's highly possible that it was originally much more progressive and that was censored by the Hollywood machine. So I would recommend that you check it out, but these are just some of the problems I noticed with it. It's not a bad film. I'd say overall I'd give it a 6.5 out of 10. Well, that's all I got for this episode. This is the conclusion of the very first episode of Material Positions. Please feel free to let me know what you think and anything you'd like to hear about going forward. I'm not going to be only doing movie reviews, obviously. We're going to be trying to do all sorts of other content, interviews, journalistic content, stuff like that. This is just a first episode to get out there that I worked on lately. So please let me know. Thank you for listening and stay safe.